Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Well, welcome. Thank you for coming to the afternoon invited session, Belief in the Modern World. I'm the chair, Ernest Morel from the University of Notre Dame. I'd like to introduce both of our presenters. They'll come up and present their papers, and at the culmination of the second paper, we should have plenty of time for Q&A. We'll come back down. They're going to present up here on the podium, and I'll ask you at that time to step forward to the mic, and we'll probably have 15, 20 minutes for questions. So our first presenter is Bill McClay. Bill is the G.T. and Libby Blankenship Chair in the History of Liberty at the University of Oklahoma. He's a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He also served on the National Council on the Humanities, the advisory board for the National Endowment for the Humanities. John Waters, our second presenter, is an Irish playwright and author. He started his career in 1981 with the Irish music journal Hot Press, and later wrote in the Irish Times from 1990 to 2014. His first book, Jiving at the Crossroads, about the cultural underbelly of Irish politics at the height of the Haughey era, became a bestseller. He went on to write and publish 8 other books, including An Intelligent Person's Guide to Modern Ireland, and Was It for This? Why Ireland Lost a Plot. He has written a number of plays for stage and radio and currently writes a fortnightly essay for First Things. The title of Bill McClay's paper is Guilt in the Immanent Frame, and the title of John's paper is The Importance of Not Being God. A higher power is indispensable for human beings and human societies. With that, please join me in welcoming our first presenter, Bill McClay.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. Carter's been trying for years to get me to come to one of these things, and now I wonder why it took so long. Carter's not known for being unpersuasive either, but I'll need no more persuading in the future. Yeah, my title, Guilt in the Immanent Frame, a term that some of you will know, and you'll know by the end of my talk, the gist of it. I want to start out recollecting, and some of you will remember this, that a number of years ago, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, the biologist Richard Dawkins, among others, launched in the UK something called the Atheist Bus Campaign, in which they had been annoyed by the fact that evangelicals were festooning buses with sort of advertisements in favor of Jesus and other such pap. And so they wanted to have their own signs to sort of counter this. And so they came up with this slogan, and Richard Dawkins, who's no mean wordsmith, had a hand in this. The slogan on their posters on the sides of buses: "There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life." This bus campaign was not notably successful. I wonder why. For one thing, there's probably no God. If I were Pascal, I'd say, well, there's enough. There's enough that's questionable. There's probably no God. Good grief. So, but the part that interests me for our purposes today is the second part. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life. The premise being that the only thing standing in the way of your ceasing to worry, of your being carefree, insouciant, and enjoying your life is this nagging, residual belief in God. And so this is a life in the immanent frame. This is a beckoning towards life in the immanent frame, life in the secular world picture with no sacred horizon. Rid of God, rid of worry. But on the contrary, we have not seen a world without worry, as the immanent frame has become more and more the norm of our existence, despite books by people like Steven Pinker and others who keep telling us that we're living in the best world ever and things are continuing to get better. Why the long face? We're living a paradox, one whose shape and character have so far largely eluded our understanding. It's the strange persistence of guilt as a psychological force in modern life that I want to concentrate in my remarks today. In fact, the word persistence understates the matter. Guilt is not merely lingered, but it's intensified, metastasized, to become an ever more powerful and pervasive element of the life of the contemporary West, even at the same time that the rich language formerly used to define it, guilt and its artifacts, has withered and faded and moved out of our discourse, sometimes moved forcibly out of our discourse. And the means of containing its effects, let alone obtaining relief from it being guilt, have become ever more elusive. We're less able to talk about things that are ever more pervasive. Dan Mahoney, some of you were probably at his talk, he had a wonderful line that is seared into my memory now, a world of limitless moralism rooted in limitless relativism. I'm going to come back to that great formulation again. It says, paradoxes set up a condition in which the phenomenon of rising guilt becomes both a byproduct and an obstacle to civilizational advance. The stupendous achievements of the West in improving the material conditions of human life and extending the blessings of liberty and dignity to more and more of the Earth's people are in danger of being countervailed and even negated by a ever-growing burden of guilt, which poisons our social relations and hinders our efforts to live happy and harmonious lives. As I've said, the modern drama of guilt has not followed the script that had been written for it. Prophets such as Friedrich Nietzsche were confident the modern Western world was finally going to throw off the metaphysical straitjacket that had confined the possibilities of previous generations. The moral reflexes that had gone along with that metaphysical framework would disappear along with them. With God dead, all things would indeed finally be permitted. Chief among the outmoded reflexes to be discarded would be the experience of guilt. Guilt was obviously a vestige for Nietzsche of irrational fear promulgated by oppressive, life-denying institutions erected in the name of a punitive deity. Indeed, Nietzsche had argued on the Genealogy of Morality, 1887, which is the locus classicus for the modern understanding of guilt. He argued the very idea of God or the gods originated hand in hand with a feeling of indebtedness to the ancestors. Debt, the words for debt and guilt in German being virtually the same. So he punned on that. The belief in gods arose in primitive societies, he speculated, out of dread of the ancestors and a feeling of indebtedness to them. This feeling grew and grew until with the Christian God, it was offered as the maximal God yet achieved, which brought about the greatest feeling of indebtedness on earth. But now, Nietzsche proclaimed, we are starting in the opposite direction with the death of God, which for Nietzsche meant his general cultural unavailability. We should see a consequent decline in the consciousness of human debt. With the cultural triumph of atheism at hand, a victory would release humanity from this feeling of being indebted towards its beginnings. Atheism would mean a second innocence, a regaining of Eden, with neither God nor Satan around to interfere with and muck up the proceedings. This is the imminent frame. There's probably no God, so stop worrying and enjoy life. Kind of pop Nietzsche. Well, of course, this is not what has happened, manifestly. I hope I don't need to prove that. Nor does there seem to be much likelihood of its doing so in the near future. Nietzsche's younger contemporary, Sigmund Freud, although wrong about a great many things, was a better prophet in this respect. In his book, Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud predicted that the tenacious scent of guilt would be, and I quote, the most important problem in the development of civilization. In fact, I continue to quote, "The price we pay for our advance in civilization is a loss of happiness through the heightening of the sense of guilt." Such guilt was hard to identify, hard to understand for Freud because it so frequently dwelled on the unconscious level. It appeared to us as a sort of unease, Unbehagen, which is actually the word translated as discontents in the title of the civilization, it's discontents. And people seek other explanations other than the real explanation for its manifestations. Guilt is tricky, it's crafty, it's a chameleon, it's capable of changing itself in its size and shape and appearance, all the while managing to deepen and persist. Freud, as I say, I'm not Freudian in very many ways, but I think this is a very rich and insightful description that he has to offer. And it's a useful starting point for us to consider a subject that my fellow historians have almost entirely neglected. That is, the steadily intensifying role played by guilt in determining the structure of our lives in the 20th and 21st centuries. By connecting the phenomenon of rising guilt to the phenomenon of civilizational advance, Freud was pointing to an unsuspected but inevitable byproduct of progress itself, a problem likely to become worse in the decades to come. We live in a therapeutic age, which means we have tried to disarm and set aside guilt's moral significance by redesignating it as just another psychological phenomenon whose proper functioning could be ascertained by its effects on one's general well-being, one's health. We've sought to demoralize guilt by treating it as a strictly subjective and emotional matter. Forgiveness has very nearly lost its moral weight entirely by being translated into an act of random kindness whose value mainly lies in the benefit it confers upon us, the forgivers. This, of course, is a betrayal of the idea of forgiveness, which is a weighty, costly thing. It only makes sense in the presence of a robust sense of justice. Without it, that sense of justice, there's a real danger of forgiveness being reduced to something genteel and passive and automatic and flimsy, a kind of sanctimonious way of saying nothing really matters very much at all. Let's move on. But there's another powerful factor at work in modernity in this regard, and one might call it, I sometimes call it, the infinite extensibility of guilt. This proceeds from a very different set of phenomena and assumptions. It's a byproduct of modernity's proudest product, its ever-growing capacity to comprehend and control the physical world. In a world in which the web of relationships between causes and effects becomes ever better understood and more easily manipulated, and individuals become ever more powerful and effective agents, at least potentially, the range of our potential moral responsibility and therefore our potential guilt also steadily expands. This is one inevitable side effect of the view of the interconnectedness of things, which fails to recognize that this means there's almost nothing for which we cannot be in some way held responsible. This may be in part behind the movement to change the name of our geological epoch from the Holocene to the Anthropocene, the first era in the life of the planet to be defined by the effects of the human presence and human power. Effects such as nuclear fallout, plastic pollution, domesticated animals, and anthropogenic climate change. Power entails responsibility, and responsibility leads to guilt. And this can be followed out at great length. Whatever donation I make to a charitable organization, it's never enough. I can never diminish my carbon footprint enough, or support medical research enough, or give to the poor enough. Colonialism, slavery, structural poverty, pollution, deforestation, there's no end to the list of things for which you and I can and should take the rap. looked at honestly, an interconnected world to be found blameless is a pipe dream, because the demands of an active conscience are literally as endless as the active imagination's ability to conjure them. And those of us who teach young people have the occasion to observe, often it's precisely the most morally perceptive and earnest individuals who have the weakest common sense defenses against this kind of overwhelming assault on their sensibilities. They can't see a logical place to stop. When they reflect on the brute fact of being alive and taking up space on the planet, using resources that could have gone to someone else, they may be led to feel guilt about the very fact of their existence. And I don't mean to mock this. I hope you don't take me as doing so. I think the questions involved are genuine and profound. They deserve to be asked. Those who struggle with issues of environmental justice and stewardship are often led to wonder if there's any way of life that might allow one to escape being implicated in the cycles of exploitation and cruelty and privilege that mark our relationship with the environment in which we live. We suffer, many of us, from a hypertrophied sense of guilt and desperately seek some path to an existence free of it. These pathologies themselves have anterior source in the very things of which we're most rightly proud: our knowledge of the world, of its causes and effects, our power to shape and alter these causes and effects. I think the problem is perfectly expressed by T.S. Eliot's famous question: after such knowledge, what forgiveness? In a world of ever-growing knowledge, there is no easy way of deciding how much guilt is enough and how much is too much. But don't worry, there's probably no God. Notwithstanding all the claims about our living in a post-Christian world devoid of censorious public morality, we live in a world that carries around an enormous and growing burden of guilt and yearns and sometimes even demands to be free of it. And that burden is ever looking for an opportunity to discharge itself. It's impossible to exaggerate how many of the deeds of individual men and women can be traced back to the powerful need of human beings to feel morally justified, to feel themselves right with the world. One would expect that such a powerful need, nearly as powerful as physical need, would continue to find ways to manifest itself, even in odd and perverse ways. How else can we account, for example, for the extraordinary rise, not just in the past 5 years, but in maybe the past 50 years, extraordinary rise of the cultural prestige of victims as a category in the contemporary world? I think the explanation is traceable back to the extraordinary weight of guilt in our time, the pervasive need to find innocence through moral absolution and to discharge one's moral burden somehow, and the fact that conventional means of finding that absolution are no longer generally available, thanks to the immanent frame. There's probably no God. Making a claim to the status of certified victim or identification with victims offers itself as a substitute means by which the moral weight of sin can be shifted and one's innocence affirmed. Recognition of this substitution can operate with particular force with certain individuals, but it's indicative, I think, of a larger shift of sensibility, a shift in the moral economy of sin in our culture as a whole. All of this creates enormous problems, especially in our public life as we assess questions of social justice and group inequity, which are almost impossible to address without such morally charged categories coming into play. Just look at the incredible spectacle of today's college campuses with their endless rounds of moral accusation and ever more baroque declarations of victimhood. These phenomena did not come out of nowhere. Same categories come into play when the issues in question are ones relating to the historical guilt of groups and nations. There's a lot to say about this and no time to say it, but it is not an exaggeration to say that one could not begin to understand the workings of world politics today without taking into account a whole range of morally charged questions of guilt and innocence. How, for example, can one understand the decision by German Chancellor Angela Merkel to admit 1 million foreign migrants a year into her country without first understanding how powerfully the burden of historical guilt weighs upon her and many other Germans? Such factors are now as much a part of historical causation and explanation as such standbys as climate, geography, access to natural resources, demographics, socioeconomic organization. There's no disputing the fact that history, in terms of the form of coming to terms with the weight of the past, is becoming an ever more salient element in national and international politics. We see it in the concern for past abuses of indigenous peoples, colonized peoples, subordinated races and classes, and the like. And we see it related in the ways that nations relate their stories. Far from being buried, the past has become ever more alive with moral contestation. But who really can adjudicate? Thinking back to Dan Mahoney's quotations, limitless moralism rooted in a limitless relativism, not a very promising ground for that kind of moral adjudication. The Germans arguably represent the most impressive example of sustained collective penitence in the history of the world. But the trouble is, how much penitence is enough? How long? Who can say? When the German people, who after all are a completely different cast of characters than those who lived under the Nazis, are free and clear, have paid their debt to the world, and no longer under a cloud of suspicion. No one could make that judgment. And there may well come a day, it may in fact have come, with the backlash against Chancellor Merkel, when the Germans have had enough of the Sisyphean guilt which they feel they have been forced to bear, and begin to seek their redemption by other means. And after all, the Nuremberg trials, the Tokyo trials, war crimes trials, were landmarks in the establishment of institutional entities administering international law. But they were, to be precise, of questionable legality, because they reflected the imposition of ad hoc ex post facto laws administered by victors whose hands were far from being entirely clean. Consider the irony of Soviet judges sitting in judgment of crimes their own regime committed with impunity. The victors themselves might have been made to stand trial had the tables been turned and the subject at hand been the bombing of civilian targets in Hiroshima and Dresden. So once again, we find ourselves confronting the paradox of sin that cannot be adequately expiated. The deeply inscribed algorithm of sin demands some kind of atonement, but some aspects of the past have no imaginable way of making that transaction possible without creating sins of equivalent or greater dimension. What possible atonement can there be within the imminent frame for the institution of slavery? It's no wonder that the issue of reparations appears periodically and probably always will. Yet it's simply beyond the power of the present or the future to atone for the sins of the past in any effective way. Those of us who teach history and take seriously the moral formation of our students have to wrestle with this paradox all the time. Again, the question arises whether and to what extent all of this has to do with our living in a world that has increasingly, for the past century or so, been run according to secular premises. The Atheist Bus Campaign, using a secular vocabulary operating within an immanent frame, which requires us to be silent about and even forget the very religious frameworks and terminologies and vocabularies within which the dynamics of sin and guilt have been rendered intelligible in the past. Just at the moment we've become more keenly aware than ever of the wages of sin in the world and more keenly anxious to address those sins. We find ourselves least able to describe them in the now forbidden terms, let alone find moral release from their weight. We have lost any semblance of a coherent idea of redemption, the idea that's always been required to accompany the concept of sin in the past, and tame its harsh potential. The presence of vast amounts of unacknowledged sin in a culture full to the brim with its own hubristic sense of world-conquering power and agency, but lacking any effectual means of achieving redemption for all the unacknowledged sin that accompanies that power. That is a moral crisis in the making, a kind of moral transactional analog to the debt crisis that threatens the world's fiscal and monetary health. Limitless moralism rooted in an unlimited relativism. The rituals of scapegoating, of public humiliation and shaming, of multiplying morally impermissible utterances and sentiments and punishing them with disproportionate severity are visibly on the increase in our public life. They're not merely signs of intolerance or incivility, but signs of a deeper moral disorder, an Unbehagen that cannot be willed away by the psychoanalytic trick of pretending that it does not exist. So where does this leave us? A couple of fairly simple conclusions. That modern science, for all of its glorious triumphs, and I don't mean that in any way ironically, still cannot instruct us how to live. It can't provide us with the ordering ends according to which our strivings as human beings should be oriented. It cannot tell us what to live for, let alone what we should be willing to sacrifice for, let alone die for. And second, science cannot do anything, really, within the frame of our full humanity, to relieve the weight of guilt on our souls, a weight to which it has added appreciably, precisely by rendering us able to be in control of and therefore responsible for and accountable for more and more elements in our lives. That growing weight seeks opportunities for release, transactional outlets, but finds no obvious or straightforward ones in the secular dispensation. Indeed, more often than not, we're left to flail about, seeking some semblance of absolution in an incoherent post-Christian moral economy that has not entirely abandoned the concept of sin, even if it doesn't know it, but lacks the transactional power of absolution or expiation, without which no moral system can be bearable. One conclusion seems unavoidable to me. Those who have viewed the obliteration of religion, and particularly Judeo-Christian metaphysics, as the modern age's great and signal act of human liberation, need to reconsider their dogmatic assurance on that point. So maybe we need a new bus slogan, and I'll offer in conclusion my own suggestion, and maybe you will come up with a better one. There's probably no future for hardcore atheism, so stop kidding yourself and seek God's peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. I'd like to offer John to come up and present his paper, which title again is The Importance of Not Being God, A Higher Power is Indispensable for Human Beings and Human Societies.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here, particularly in such relaxed atmosphere, because I was here last year and things were not quite so relaxed. I had a police officer, an armed police officer standing behind me, and it's a bit of a relief in one way, but then again, I think, it's always the beginning of the end when they take away your security detail. So if you don't see me again, start asking questions. I was going to talk about the question of what happens in the case of the individual and the society when each, in its own way or his own hard way, jettisons God, the higher power. And I still want to do that, but I had intended to focus more on using my Ireland, my country, as an example. But I want to do something more now. I was inspired by Professor McIntyre's lecture yesterday to maybe become a bit more focused, particularly into the events of this year, in May 25th, when we had a referendum which destroyed the right to life of the unborn child. And that's, we need to be precise about what actually happened, and I want to go into that later. That's what happened. It wasn't an abortion referendum as such. It was a referendum on destroying the right to life of a child. So, not the unborn child. I first heard the phrase higher power in Alcoholics Anonymous 30 years ago when I went to my first meeting, having reached my rock bottom. It took me a couple of more years to get the message, but that was when I began the journey back, having spent perhaps about 15 years in the wilderness of agnosticism, if not atheism. I'm not sure if I understand the difference entirely. And that's an interesting history in the sense that you tend to see things that you wouldn't have seen without it, I think, in the general picture. My upbringing was, in religious terms, I was born into an intensely Catholic family in the west of Ireland and in an intensely Catholic town. And Jesus was part of our lives every day. He was, as I said before, he was in every room I was ever in as a child. I had conversations with him. He was the person I spoke to in my head. And that continued into my teens. And then it started to break up. And it broke up really because of the adolescence, teenage years, but that coinciding with an explosion of events in Ireland, the advent of, well, this was, I suppose, the early 70s, which is when the 60s arrived in Ireland. So we had rock and roll and TV and Georgie Best. You won't know who Georgie Best is, most of you, I guess, but he was the greatest footballer who ever lived, and he was from Ireland. Look him up. I wanted to be John Lennon and George Best combined. And the way I often say, this created what appeared to be an insoluble conundrum, in that I didn't think I could have this. It didn't seem that I could have this and Jesus as well. There's something about Jesus and what I was told about him led me to believe he wouldn't really approve of all this stuff. That he would kind of, be shaking his head all the time at me. So the way I put it is I had a choice between Elvis and Jesus, and I chose Elvis for a while. And that was the start of my journey into freedom. And I'm kind of going to foreshorten the narrative a little bit, but this took me 15 years to go out there, and I ended up in Alcoholics Anonymous, having discovered the limits of my own freedom and my own body and my own being. And there I was introduced to the higher power, which was actually called the higher power, as a way of avoiding the word God, because they also referred to God as you understand him, which was, they still said him then. They say him or her or it or something. But they said at the beginning, because one of the chapters in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous is called We Agnostics, which was really shocked to me when I picked up that book first and thought, they've been expecting me. How do they know this? And there's a reason for that there's a connection between the addiction, between the alcoholism and the agnosticism. They're almost the same thing in a certain sense. And the antidote they were offering me was God. But they were kind of soft-focusing this a little bit. But nevertheless, they were talking about the higher power. They said, well, it can be the light bulb, higher power. Or it can be the group. But you need to find something like this as a first step on your way back. Because they were taking me back to where I came from. back to those childhood days, the first steps in Christianity, in Christendom, without me being told this in express terms. For some reason that I didn't understand. I thought it was some kind of Puritanism. You know, this is, okay, boy, you've had your fun. Time to get on your knees. And, you know, be thankful you're even alive. And that didn't seem a great deal, but I had no great choices, so I went with it for as long as it took in the end. And one of the things I came across very soon was a book called Not God by a German guy, Ernest Schutz. And he, the title is telling. It was a book that was very much in use in early Alcoholics Anonymous. It was about Alcoholics Anonymous. And the idea was that even if you didn't believe in God, there was something almost more important than that to begin with. That you needed to start believing that you were not God, which sounds a weird thing. But the thesis of not God is that alcoholism, addiction, these are diseases of modernity. They're diseases of a society, of a humanity that is incapable any longer of suffering the authority of a higher power. It cannot tolerate the idea of something above, and so seeks to kick God off the throne, which he has occupied presumably through childhood, and to replace him, take his place. But the problem with this is that when you end up on God's throne with all of God's responsibilities in your life, even if only in your own life and the lives of those around you, but with none of God's powers, you've got a real problem. And so the solution of the person who ends up as the alcoholic to this conundrum is alcohol. Alcohol is what squares the circle. Alcohol is what destroys the terror that arises from having all of God's responsibilities in your own life and none of his power. So I started to think about myself in an entirely different way, that I had done this, and I thought about, well, why did I do this? Well, when I was a child, God was totally everywhere. There was no question about it. There was no controversy. He was in our beings. It was implicit in every word, every sentence, even if God was never mentioned. It was implicit in the language we used, our parents and our neighbors and ourselves. We passed, when we went to school, we went into the church. The church was the only house in the town, apart from our own, that we could go into without asking anybody. It's an incredible thing. First place I knelt upon a carpet, or indeed encountered any kind of carpet in any sense whatever, was in a church when I was an altar boy. And so Romano Guardini talks about this in terms of the Middle Ages and since the immediacy of the divine idea. This is in the end of the modern world. How it seems axiomatic that God is, that nobody needs to even think about it. And that seems to be, to our modern minds, perhaps even to believers, for an instant, maybe, it occurs to you, well, that's because they were stupider than we are, or something. That it's something to do with the chronology of time. This is the kind of the modern idea, that there's something about 2018 that would make that obviously implausible. You know, which is a ridiculous idea when you think about it. I remember once when I was about 11 or something, my sister was a couple of years older, and she was having a row with my father, and she said, in exasperation, she said, "Daddy, don't you realize it's 1968? And he just burst out laughing. And I had absolutely no idea why he was laughing. But I do now. But if I was to say to you now, don't you realize that it's 2018, most people would just nod. Yeah, it is, isn't it? Yeah, come on, get with it. But it's the same point. So this is a kind of an illusion of what Pope Benedict called the bunker, the modern place we have built to hide away from the mystery. But the problem is we can't hide away from the mystery because the mystery is inside, and that's what happens to the alcoholic. Because when you try to replace God with alcohol, it doesn't work. Because that's what you're doing, in effect. You're strengthening your fragile being against the unknowability of reality with what is in effect a poison. And so this taught me many lessons, but it taught me above all that this God thing was not something separate, not something dispensable, that I had misunderstood myself. And when I think back on those years when I was going around, I think it's something like that I began to develop a sense through my teens that, you know, something like a clockwork toy or something like that, or with some kind of power pack that would last maybe 75 years, and I would just wander about the earth doing stuff. And that I didn't really need to think about the idea of being given a life, of being generated in the moment by something. These were sort of alien ideas, and that I didn't need to think about where I came from or where I was going particularly. I needed to just focus on the day and just keep going and enjoy my life, you know, stop worrying, you know. God probably doesn't exist, something like that. That was, I think I might have made that line up there, Professor. And it took me this rock bottom, the ignominy, the humiliation of alcoholism, to realize that I had been made, I was being made, I am being made now, and nothing of me is mine. My voice is not mine. I didn't decide how it should sound. It would probably sound something different if I had. You know, I'd have a better chin, maybe. Wouldn't need to have a beard. Not everybody has a beard that's hiding their chin, by the way. I only made that up. So that's in the personal sense. That's in the personal sense that, you know, when you take that higher power out. You know, the mechanistic imagery didn't leave me, because for a long time, even after I thought I had got God, I had this image of myself as kind of like a bit like a, I don't know what you call them. I think you call them dodgems, you know, those bumper cars we call them in Ireland, bumpers. I do that thing and you drive around, but there's this arm that's going up and it's sparking off the grill above. I thought of myself, I'm a bit like that, going around, you know. That's my higher power. I thought of it mechanistically and psychologically. And then I started to dig deeper, because I'd realized in the course of this that I'd been wrong about pretty much everything. And I started to dig deeper and deeper into different things and realized that actually those guys that I'd completely dismissed actually knew a thing or two, and I should start paying attention. So that was approximately my journey back. And Alcoholics Anonymous always says that you end up, most alcoholics end up back in the religion of their birth. And that's been my experience of meeting other alcoholics as well. So Ireland, my country, it seems to me, having watched my country, that in a certain sense, what's happening in Ireland is, I don't want to be arrogant about this, but it's as if my country is now following the path I took, but maybe a couple of decades later. I'm not quite sure when it started. I stopped drinking in 1990. But the condition, the underlying condition, the desire to jettison God, is very prevalent in Ireland now. You know, that idea that God is really an embarrassing idea to us. And that has its roots in actually another condition, which is the post-colonial condition, which Professor McCary referred to, this idea of, which is very prevalent in Ireland, but not recognized at all, not understood, not talked about. And the essence of the colonialism is the first thing, as Franz Fanon wrote, that the first thing a colonizer does in a new country is to impress upon the natives that before the advent of colonialism, there was nothing but savagery. And once this is impressed upon the natives, they spend the rest of their lives trying to prove that it's not true. And the way they prove it's not true is to become more and more like the colonizer. And so this is one of the reasons that Ireland needs to jettison Catholicism, because it's unfashionable. They've long, historically, going right back, been told that Catholicism is a backward, ridiculous faith. And they've started to believe this. And this is an unconscious element of what's happening. as it was in my own case, but I can see it in the culture now, very much alive. If I was to identify a moment, just as I can remember the moment I had my last drink, I can remember when I had my first drink. I was 17. I was 35 when I had my last drink. I would identify a moment in Irish life when this really started big time. And that was at about 12 o'clock on Monday, October the 1st, 1979. And that was the day that John Paul II took off to come to the United States, having spent 4 days in Ireland. And this seems like a paradoxical thing to say, because this was the most intense moment, perhaps, in the entire history of Irish Catholicism these days. And the event in the Phoenix Park was the biggest event in Europe at its time, and possibly hasn't been excelled. Well over 1 million people turned out to see the Pope. And before he came, they built effectively a city in the park. They put down drainage and water supply, everything that a city would need. And the sense of expectation was quite extraordinary. Now, I'm telling this as somebody who was, at that point, in my agnostic phase on the outside, watching, having this sneaking regard for this Pope, but not wanting to be part of it. I was a roadie with a band at the time, and we were playing in Derry when he spoke in the Phoenix Park. And I remember that night, I have never felt a sense of alienation like it, because when we came back from the gig, we met about 1 million cars coming towards us, and I felt, I'm not part of this. I don't belong to this. And now I feel the same, but from the other direction. So it's kind of weird. And my theory is this, that in those 4 days, we experienced for the last time, in a really intense way, what Romano Guardini spoke about, that intensity that characterized the Middle Ages and their sense of the presence of God, the obviousness of God, the inevitability of God, the unavoidable nature of God. As my father did, and I saw it in his life. I saw the way he would work. I saw the way he would go to Mass on a Sunday. And he would pray the rosary during Mass. And as he prayed, he knelt in front of the confessional in the same place every Sunday. And as he prayed, he would fall forward as though he were being ordained, almost lying on the ground in the end, to Mass. This is all gone. And it's gone because of cultural factors. But it's gone most of all because I believe the form of reason that was taught to the Irish, ironically by the church for the most part, was inadequate to sustaining a belief in Christ. So I think that chapter is closed, and the next one will have to be, that will open, will have to be to present Christ to the Irish people, as Christ was presented to me in Alcoholics Anonymous, as a necessity for your very structure, for your very being, for your very existence. It's not a gratuitous thing. It's not an optional thing. You don't have a choice. And that's not a moral statement. That's simply a fact. You can't be human without understanding these things. And if you look at Ireland now, in terms of the metaphor of, and it's more than a metaphor, of addiction, you can see the same conditions becoming generalized as occurred in my life, a sense of meaninglessness turning into a pursuit of something of meaning in the wrong source, in the wrong place. You know, I remember when I was drinking, one of the patterns, I remember watching myself, and, you know, I would go from pub to pub and drink a one drink, and drink faster in each one, going to the next, looking for something, never finding it, going on. And then getting a bus home. One night I got a bus home, and then on the way home I changed my mind and got the next bus back and started again. This kind of craziness and craziness is a word we now need to see in the context of what's happened in Ireland, because Ireland is essentially unhinged. What's happened in Ireland is actually not a normative political phenomenon. It is an extreme phenomenon of history colliding with postmodernism. The history of the hurt that Ireland endured and the failure to deal with that. And now the collision, the manipulation of all of those forces by external agents. LGBT goons stalking the land, looking for somebody to intimidate. Demonizing people, putting people out of work, demanding heads on plates. But I want to come to the May 25th, because I think this is probably the most, I wrote at the time that May beforehand, I wrote that May 25th, if it went the wrong way, would be the bloodiest day in Irish history, and that's saying a hell of a lot, and will be. Not yet, but it will be. Because on May 25th, we didn't just vote for abortion. That, in a certain sense, we didn't vote for abortion at all. What we voted for, as I say, was to remove the right of a section of our own number. This is unprecedented in human civilization. To the best of my knowledge, no population in the world has ever voted to make it possible to kill a section of itself, an innocent section of itself. And that's such a serious matter that I actually would go further and say that everybody was made complicit in this. This question should never have been asked, and it certainly should never have been answered. We did not have the right to do this, because this was a fundamental right, written into the fundamental rights section of our Constitution, which nobody had the right, no government, no voter, nobody, no parliament had the right to vote down. And it was voted down. And I say, you know, now I would say, what I did say at the beginning, but not loudly enough, that we should not have voted on that. We should not have voted. In a certain sense, those of us who voted no to that are incriminated as well, because we have honored that obscenity by arguing about it. Imagine if we were to have a vote here about whether the people on this side here should be allowed to live or die. How would we feel about ourselves carrying out that vote? Yet this is what has happened in Ireland. So this is not a political matter. This is an existential catastrophe, which, in my view, comes from what I've described approximately. Many other factors, of course. The level of propaganda beaming into Ireland now. Ireland is a very vulnerable place because it's so open, and that's a benefit in lots of ways, but it makes it an easy laboratory specimen for these global bully boys who want to make a point, who want to scalp, a Catholic scalp to show the world. So that's where I think it stands. During the course of the referendum, I spent a lot of time over the 6 months beforehand trying to persuade any lawyer, to take a case with me, to challenge this in a court, to say, okay, let's forget about all the unborn children. Let's talk about just one unborn child. Let's go to the judge's house and say, there is a child called Tom, and he is innocent of anything. He has never done anything wrong. He has never done anything. He is voiceless. He doesn't speak the language. If you had a Polish defendant in your court, you would get an interpreter. And not one judge in one sentence of any judgment has ever said that this child is any less of a human being than you are or I am. How can you or anybody put on a black cap and condemn this child to death? And all the time I met this same thing, which was that this has already been decided because natural law is no longer regarded as trumping any other elements of the Constitution. And I looked into that, and I found that what it was a judgment that happened back in 1905. It's very complicated. But essentially, it was about the right to information about abortion. And what happened was that in a case in the Supreme Court, the case was put, the natural law, the fundamental right to life of the child, and the judges said, this doesn't trump anything in the Constitution. But I said, but isn't that a little bit different to saying that there is now a life in the balance? Not just one life, but tens of thousands, maybe 1 million lives and the rest of all our lives. And the lawyers just walked away from me. And in a while, they wouldn't return my calls. They wouldn't talk to me. There was one guy I'd been searching for weeks, and Rita, my wife, was sitting with a cafe, and she says, that guy you're looking for is just walking in the door. Oh, hang on, he's gone again. Why is that? Is it because my argument was a bad argument? Haha, no. It was because it was a good argument. And lawyers didn't want to go to judges with a good argument that they didn't want to hear. Because then judges would have to actually write down on paper, not something abstract about the right to information, but whether or not it was okay to allow a child to die. And they didn't want to do that. They wanted the Irish people to make this filthy decision. And the Irish people did. So this is what's happened in my country. One thing I definitely agreed with Professor McIntyre about yesterday was when he said that we need to move from rights to justice. And I would elaborate, I would interpret that, I mean, I read it immediately as the Aquinas version of definition of justice, which is to each what is owed, with a constant, I think, constant and perpetual heart. And that's, you know, when you actually look at that equation, you understand how it would be impossible for a court working off that balance as opposed to that idea, that concept, to find against a child, or indeed for the people to find against a child, if you're talking about justice. Because the debts of justice in the situation of a pregnancy, let's look at it for a moment, just finally. There are debts of justice from the mother to the child. There are debts of justice from the father to the child. There are debts of justice from the father to the mother and the mother to the father. There are debts of justice from the society to the child and to the father and to the mother. And there are just debts of justice from the father and the mother to the society. The one place, the one track in which there are no debts of justice is from the child to anybody else. And yet, we now propose in Ireland, as in the United States you do, to impose all of the penalty, all of the debt, on the most defenseless, the most innocent, the most voiceless of all the parties in this equation. This is what happens when you replace justice with rights. Because what happens is the equation is falsified, and the child is pushed over to the edge and gradually falls off the edge. And so we're talking about medical issues or, rights to privacy or compassion, comfort care. It's very important, that people in the world realize that what's happened in Ireland is the only time that this ever happened in human civilization. It is a disgrace that cries out to heaven for vengeance. I believe that vengeance will come. I won't cry when it does. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, John. Now I'd like to invite people to come to the closest microphone. We have two downstairs and one upstairs. We have about 15 minutes. Thank you both for your wonderful talks, but also thank you for staying on time. So we'll just go back and forth from the left podium to the right to upstairs.
Thank you. This is to Mr. Waters, and I was wondering, to connect it a little bit with McIntyre's talk, what role does the material prosperity, the unprecedented material prosperity that Ireland has experienced in the last few decades, play with the loss of God and the deification of man, if you will, and what role does that play for how we look at economic development going into the future?
Well, it plays a huge role, I think. The period of the Celtic Tiger, which is approximately between 98 and 2008, was a time when really we shifted to a consumer society and went completely crazy. And then that was followed by a period of maybe 5 or 6 years of recrimination when the economy collapsed. Of course, it was entirely illusory, the boom, because it was all based on borrowed money and on building and building houses. And so people refused to accept that this wasn't actually permanent, because there was a sense almost that, you know, because for so long Ireland had been poor, and it was like that history had some kind of grudge against Ireland, and it was like then and suddenly it sort of got over it, and history was kind of on our side for a change, and then so that was followed by and that vulnerability that came in then afterwards was capitalized upon by these groups who just descended on Ireland and pumped out their propaganda and their tactics, you know, of really anybody who dissented would be attacked and destroyed. And the media became completely corrupted. The parliament became completely partisan. Everybody became afraid to speak. So there were virtually nobody in the parliament, a couple of people who spoke out. But yeah, there was you see, I think it's complicated because you have to go back to the model of Christianity, and I've spoken about it in general terms, but it was deficient. The quality of Irish Christianity was deficient in terms of reason, because it was a sense that you didn't question it. There was no great debate or discussion about faith or religion. It was never a philosophical question. You know, I don't say that makes it in the case of each person. I mean, people talk about a simple faith. I don't think it was simple. It was actually a way of seeing the world that seemed to be obvious, that you didn't make yourself. I don't make myself now. Even though these questions might never be articulated, they were implicit in the way that human beings behaved in Ireland. And then in the bunker that Pope Benedict talked about, which, you know, was really this kind of modern edifice of where everything is decided by human beings, where everything is organized, where everything is defined, and this sort of warm, like this room, you know, it's like if we lived here long enough, we would get to know it intimately and become experts in everything about this room, about the temperature. We could walk around in the dark without bumping into each other. And that's kind of like what the bunker means to me. And so all of that, I think, happened in those years. And then when it collapsed, there was absolute grief. I'm not exaggerating, like people were crazy. And I think that actually now this craziness continues. I mean, I get up in the morning and I look out my window and I can actually see, I can measure the extent to which the craziness has increased overnight. I can see it somehow. I just know, oh, this is going to be a really crazy day. And it will be. So, but there are so many factors. I mean, Ireland is so small and so vulnerable that these things are more acute there than they are. We don't have any counterculture, for example. I mean, I stopped being a journalist 2 days after the gay marriage referendum of 2015 because I couldn't take any more, but that my colleagues were still calling themselves journalists when they clearly weren't. And, you know, I didn't see that I was the same species as them, never mind the same profession. And so, yes, it is related to prosperity, this pseudo-prosperity that developed in Ireland after '98. But it's not the full story. I mean, there are many other elements. Ireland then became a really attractive place for multinationals because of our tax laws and so on, which is really probably the worst thing that ever happened to us. You know, because it has, again, exacerbated this idea of pseudo-prosperity. and postpone the day when we have to stand on our own feet and have real leaders as opposed to messenger boys, and so on. So I think that you can, from a distance, exaggerate those factors, the economic factors, but they do have a role to play. But I think fundamentally it's a problem of reason, and that particularly young people now, they think it's clever to say that, to laugh at God. We just had a blasphemy referendum. Like the government gave these young people a referendum in which they could express their contempt for the religious sensibility by getting rid of the constitutional provision on blasphemy, against prohibition on blasphemy. That's the kind of thing that's going on, that they're trying to sell to the world an idea of Ireland past as being like a Taliban country, Catholic Taliban. And so this is, again, part of the craziness. So yeah, the economic thing is important, but there are so many factors which are linking together that, even when you live there, you can't really figure everything out until a long time after it's happened.
Thank you.
Hi, my question's for Mr. Waters. Lewis Pearson, the University of St. Francis. The end of your presentation put me in mind of a quote from a previous session. I think it was from Solzhenitsyn, that you're only allowed to critique your country if you love her like a mother. I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, well, I think that's so true. And I mean, I don't know any Irish person who doesn't love their country, in some sense. I think that's probably been corrupted in the last 30 years because of the attacks on the revolution of 1916 and the effects of the campaign of the Provisional IRA and so on. So it's quite hard to articulate a love of country. If you actually remember those years of the 90s, I mean, the only place you could actually really express a nationalistic sentiment and wave an Irish flag with abandon was at a soccer match, an English game. So that was kind of weird. But I mean, if you ask me now, I don't have a simple answer. If you ask me, do I love my country? Because I don't love the government. I don't love the parliament. I don't love the media. I don't love the establishment. I don't love the official Ireland. I love the landscape. I love some of the people. I'm getting choosy. And I think that's going to be the way, I mean, our country's been basically, I was going to say a terrible word there. It's been mugged. I think that's a safe enough word. Mugged. And it's been sold out. I mean, we have treacherous people as leaders. Treacherous people. And we have no way of having a conversation. Everything is corrupted. So it's pretty hopeless right now, But we believe, we have a faith that it's not in our hands and that something will happen. There's a reason for all of this, I guess.
Thank you for your question. We'll take the balcony.
Hi there. My name is Cody Cooper. I'm an assistant professor of political science at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, and my question is for Bill McClay. I wanted to ask you about, I think you demonstrated well in the imminent frame, it doesn't make sense to cut off the Christian framework of sin and still talk about guilt. But I wanted to ask you if you think within a Christian frame, a nation's repentance makes sense. You seem to suggest maybe, but at times you express doubt that there are certain sins we can never atone for. And I'm thinking of Solzhenitsyn, who says in one of his essays that a nation is a community mystically welded together in a community of guilt, and its destiny is repentance. Do you think within the Christian framework a nation can atone for past sins? And you mentioned slavery as something, how could we ever really atone for that? Within a Christian framework, do you think there could be a common repentance like the sort that Solzhenitsyn holds out hope for?
Yeah, I did mean that in that whole discussion of the sort of accelerating preoccupation of historians and of their publics with the sort of digging into the past and debunking of myths and the revelation, maybe over revelation or over accentuation of sins in some cases, but not in all cases. I meant that the part of what I was getting at is the irony that this is accelerating at the very time that the resources for thinking about, let alone enacting, that kind of redemptive gesture is disappearing. That we really don't have. We're conscious of using an antiquated language when we resort to it, but within a Christian framework, particularly an overwhelmingly dominant Christian society, as the 19th century United States was, or although for Catholics it wasn't so great, it was Christian but Protestant. So the whole question of what kind of degree of consensus is involved is important. But look, the Bible speaks of nations. There's clearly some way in which collective entities in the biblical understanding have a kind of moral accountability. And if they have a moral accountability and moral agency, then there must be some way of appealing to higher power for redemption. So yeah, sure, I don't have a problem with that. But I think in a post-Christian context, it becomes very, very problematic. And that's really, I think, the thrust of my remarks, is that we have all this moral sentiment. We're all dressed up with nowhere to go in the society we're living in now. A great question, thank you.
Great, thank you. So we have 3 more people standing, so we'll take these 3 questions. If we're succinct in the questions and answers, we should be okay for time.
I have a question for Professor McClay also. I'm Jim Hankins from Harvard University. Thank you very much for this very profound reflection on the nature of guilt in the imminent frame and the kind of anxiety and endless quality of it, the unlimited quality of it. I heard you use the word redemption, absolution, expiation, and I was waiting for you to use the word forgiveness. And it strikes me that one problem with the imminent frame is there's no forgiveness. We noticed this with the Me Too movement, but even with the Germans and the Holocaust, there's no one to give forgiveness because forgiveness is personal. And you need a personal God to give forgiveness. What if you could talk about that?
Oh yeah, there's a lot to say. I mean, forgiveness is a word that's everywhere. This is a sort of an Oprah Winfrey word, forgiveness. Forgive yourself as you're eating those cookies out there in the lobby. It's really, in its deepest sense, forgiveness is about the overriding of justice, of what is just, of the just demands of a creditor on a debtor. When we talk about the forgiveness of debts, I mean, that's really, I think, the most clear expression of what forgiveness really means. It really means you give up your money that you're entitled to if you forgive somebody a debt. So when we pray, forgive us our trespasses or debts, for a few Presbyterians might be in the crowd here, that's what we're saying. That we let go of what are just demands. I think the word has become incredibly watered down, and in the process of becoming watered down, the reality of what it represents is lost. So in a sense, it's being made ubiquitous and being made meaningless and unavailable at the same time. That's the way I see it. There's a whole, you should look at, go down to the Barnes & Noble and look in the self-help books. There's a whole section of forgiveness books. I mean, it's a hot topic. And forgiveness is Greg Easterbrook, the journalist, who I thought was a pretty sensible guy, wrote a book about how forgiveness is good for you. Forgiveness makes you feel better. You don't go around holding all those negative feelings, and you let go of them. And who cares about justice? You feel better. This is completely a betrayal of the sort of the quality of mercy, is in The Merchant of Venice, a wonderful speech. It's completely lost that sense of sacrificial quality in forgiveness, that you really are giving up something to which you were entitled by forgiving somebody. I don't want to pick on the Me Too movement. There's any number of other things that one could adduce as examples of the sort of loss of forgiveness in the world. But I think you're right too that it's very difficult to understand forgiveness in collective terms. That it is ultimately most meaningful when it's an individual person making that. When the United States Senate passes a resolution apologizing for slavery. I'm sorry, this doesn't really seem like very much to me. This seems to me what they call virtue signaling, and not a real, because there's no sacrifice there. Nobody's giving up anything by voting for this resolution. It's a campaign booster. So, yeah, enough said.
Okay, thank you.
Michał Czewski from Poland, Center for the Thought of John Paul II. Question to Professor Maclay, following what you said. Shouldn't we disaggregate then the notion of guilt? Because there's self-serving guilt, there's easy guilt, and it seems to me that we can be guilty of many things as long as they are not our sins. So I think that in modernity, guilt is everywhere, save for the very place where we are. That's my question. And then to John Waters, I wanted to thank you for most profound talk, if not witness.
Yes, I thank you too. Disaggregating is always a good idea, particularly with a term like that. And I think I'm working on a book on this, and I'm discovering that I'm really having to do something like what you're describing, and also that the distinction between guilt and shame, which used to be sort of hardwired with cultural anthropologists and such, and then in recent years they've been moving towards saying that they're really the same thing. Well, I think actually they're not. So I'm going to have in this book to make a case for shame as a kind of distinct category of moral sanction as opposed to guilt. But yeah, I think that move actually helps to focus the concept a little bit more. But the most important thing is one has to distinguish between guilt as a psychological phenomenon and guilt as a forensic phenomenon. That somebody is guilty of a crime. Somebody may not be guilty of a crime, but they may feel guilt. These are two very distinct things, and it's important to distinguish them.
Okay, thank you. So I'll ask for a succinct question and a succinct response, and we'll finish the session.
Sure. Ian Tuttle from the Catholic University of America. My question is for Dr. Maclay, following on, I think, in fact, what you just said. You delineated in the talk what you see as a progression toward infinite responsibility as we gain more and more power in the world. And it struck me thinking about a passage from the Brothers Kay, the Confession of Father Zosima, in which he says the moment of his conversion takes place when he accepts infinite responsibility for the world.
Yes.
And Solzhenitsyn picks that up in the passage on the ascent. He says the moment in which I was able to begin my ascent was when I accepted that I was responsible for all of the evil in the world. I wonder if in addition to forensic and psychological forms of modes of guilt, this quality of infinity points to a sort of ontology of guilt also.
Yeah, it's not bearable. That perception is not bearable by the human frame without a resort to transcendence. I mean, and that's, I think, one of the many teachings of the Brothers Kay, among many other things. How can you disaggregate all the separate themes of a novel like that? But I would agree, and I think that the notion of the infinite extensibility of sin and all that. I hope I got this across. I'm not introducing these ideas as fallacies to mock. Just as when I run across students who really do suffer, these pangs of anxiety, it's just sort of like J. Alfred Prufrock, do I dare to eat a peach? If I'm, they agonize over a paper or plastic at the checkout at the grocery store. I think it's not only cruel as a kind of moral blindness to mock that. I think there is a way in which, if we understand ourselves properly, I always say, and I don't, you said these things much more eloquently than I could, but that at least in my own case, my spiritual life, my real life with God began when I realized I had done things I could never be forgiven for by anybody or anything. And then you're thrown back on either bearing the unbearable or finding Christ. Those are the choices.
Please join me again in thanking Bill and Tom.